Our next two speakers have a lot of information to share with you all. We have Jing Wu. He is a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and also associate director of the Asian Institute of Supply Chains and Logistics. He has been published in numerous academic journals, and specifically his research on the supply chain impact of COVID-19 and the trade war has led to not only republication, but also him giving lectures to the Fed, to the IMF, to the Asian Development Bank, among others. So he will be speaking about supply chains as well as other issues on China. We also have Sanjana Goswami with us. She is a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, for real this time. And she is an international trade economist who specializes in labor markets. So she's also at the National University of Singapore and spoke about the China shock last year, and we'll be going into that a bit more this year as well. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers on China. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, so my slide deck. Yeah. So I'm going to be very quickly going through two major events between US and China when it comes to international trade. Thanks for the introduction. I just want to also add that I am an academic and I'm a trade economist. So we're not very good at predicting the future, but we dive into understanding what is going on now and what happened in the past. So that's kind of what I'm going to walk you through. What are the academics saying about all this? What can we learn from it going forward? So I'll be talking about first the China shock very briefly, and then talking about the US-China trade war, which is currently ongoing. And in the forefront of all this, what really we are thinking about are distributional impacts. The thing is that these shocks did not impact everyone in the same way. It depends where you're located, what occupation, scale, wage, education, and so on, right? So that is the major learning from this stuff. Okay, so everybody knows that China, became a huge export powerhouse in a very short period of time. So this graph just basically shows how quickly it did that. It went from 5% of world manufacturing value added or exports to 15 to 20% in such a short span of time. This graph shows the same thing. It's a little small, so I'll tell you what to look at. In 1990, these are all the top countries by share of exports, and China didn't even feature in the top list in 1990. In 2000 is the first green bar that you see. So green are developing countries. When it joined the WTO, it was already among the top 10 or so. By 2010, it was already number one. And if you see 2020, 10 years later, the second country is not even close. It's maybe halfway of what China has. So all of this happened really quickly. So hence came the term, the China shock, right? So what I would like to clarify here is that there is a misconception that all of this happened because China joined the WTO, all other countries reduced their tariffs, China has all this access, and that's what helped it do that. That is actually not that accurate. Most countries had already reduced their tariffs. The only thing that had changed that now the uncertainty is gone. Now the producers in all these countries, they don't have to wonder whether these tariffs will remain low, whether they will go up. So that really helps businesses to make decisions for the long run, which helps them put them on the growth path, right? And that is the issue we are having now. There's so much uncertainty. Businesses are not able to plan long term. So joining the WTO meant that China itself had to do a bunch of domestic reforms, which it was already doing prior to joining the WTO, but it had to do even more. And all of these things combined really led to this spectacular growth that we saw. So what is the China shock? Why do we need to study it? Why do we care about it? It's basically the very rapid growth of Chinese exports to the world. But there are three features of this shock. One is that it was very large. Now, before this, when trade economists are trying to understand how trade affects the income distribution or employment, there weren't really such big, stark shocks to really study. Because for the most part, trade shocks are like some countries reduce their tariffs, right? But then tariffs are put in, they're negotiated with other countries. It's not random. You decide, it's very intentional. So there are a lot of things going on. It's not like a shock coming from outside. So the China shock was large, so we can capture it. Second, it was unexpected. China was certainly one of the countries that could have grown like it did, but it was not really on people's radar. There were some other countries that could have shown good growth potential, but nobody really imagined China would grow like that. So it is unexpected. It's like an external shock. And third, the China shock is a very specific shock. Other large countries usually specialize in like commodities or things like that. But China had a very narrow comparative advantage. And this is very different from what used to happen before. China was good at labor-intensive manufacturing, very, very specific. So now, the thing is that the very first trade model predicted exactly what we saw happen, but what we didn't know what would be the magnitude of such shocks is that when you compete with a country that is very specialized in something, of course, you're going to lose employment in that thing and so on. So all of those things happened. But what the major learning from the China shock is not that import competing jobs were lost. It's that the effect of these jobs were the scarring impacts. They were permanent. So for instance, for the US, manufacturing jobs were the high-paying jobs for non-college educated workers, right? And now when these jobs are not available, there is really no replacement. So it's a permanent earnings loss for them, either a reduction or loss. And that is what we as labor economists or trade economists did not anticipate, that such a big impact would be had. So that is the major learning from the China shock. There are distributional impacts, and they can be large and they can be persistent. So the China shock helped the research community because now we have a shock. We can actually study what happens when there's trade, how does it affect distributions. There's so many papers on this. And it also helps with policy. We can understand what can be used now that we know this happens, right? So this is just one figure from the first paper that started this movement 10 years ago, Otter, Don, and Hansen. If you want to learn anything about the China shock, you should Google these 3 names and you'll get a bunch of results. I believe they also have a website where they collate all this information. And basically this chart shows the blue line is China's imports to the US divided by what the US is consuming. So Chinese import penetration into the US. And that had been going up, right? From 1987 to, I can't see, but until 2007 or so. At the same time, the US manufacturing employment to population is going down, right? Now, if you show this to an economist, they're not easily convinced. I mean, clearly they're correlated, right? One is going up, one is going down at the same time. But they're not convinced that one causes the other, and that hence the China shock study. So I'll very briefly tell you what we know. There's so many papers on this. I have a few myself. But basically, China's rapid rise, while it was really, really great for everyone, enormously positive for world welfare, they created these identified losers in these pockets. And basically, they have this permanent job loss, right? The industries that were facing the competition, not only did they shut down factories, they had to fire people, they had to basically, the structure of their operations changed. And at the same time, it was not all negative because the exporters or producers that need inputs now suddenly had access to all these cheaper inputs, and they actually created enough jobs to more than offset the job losses from China. But like I said, that's not of course there's going to be job losses, but the learning here is that these job losses were scarring and permanent. So basically, I went too far. By the time we get to 2016, there's already a little bit of grumble about, oh, maybe trade is not helpful, maybe trade is taking away jobs and all of that. And in the 2016 presidential campaign, both Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, they were voicing opposition to trade integration, we should protect our workers and all of that. But we could not have anticipated that we are going to actually have that after decades of the US being, the champion of reducing tariffs across the world, that they're suddenly going to become protectionist. So here we are. So in 2018, out of nowhere, suddenly there were these large tariffs. So initially, so actually I'll explain the graph first. So you can see that the blue line, the solid blue line, were US tariffs on Chinese exports. So on average, in the beginning of 2018, they were around 3%, right? And they stand now at around 20% or so. And this is the average of all products. So this is a very high average. So some products have really high tariff increases. For China, the average in the beginning in 2018 was around 8%, and now it stands also around 21, 22%. So this is huge. Nobody would have expected this. And truly, I'll tell you the short-run results of this, but we don't even begin to understand what the long-run effects might be of such a reversal. Because the same models or the same analysis we did for the tariff reduction don't apply to this, because now the economy, the world has changed. So, and all the action that you see, the lines going up, so between 2018, 2019, all of the action of the trade war happened. They started with washing machine tariffs, solar panel tariffs, and so on, and full-blown tariff war between US and China. This graph shows when we got to January 2020, both countries were going back and forth, and they decided, let us keep these high tariffs, but for now, let's not go back and forth anymore. And there were a bunch of things in this document called the Phase 1 agreement, which really didn't do anything. But one of the very talked about points was that China was now to buy $200 billion extra of stuff from the US, which obviously did not happen. And even if it had to happen, I mean, it just makes the US more dependent on China. So the whole point was a bit lost on most people. So this is where we are. And then, of course, economists started digging into the data and learning more about it. So currently, what we know about the short-run effects, some are very obvious. The US exports or Chinese exports on all these products that were tariff went down. But what was interesting was that there was complete pass-through. In other words, the tariff was completely passed on to the consumers in both sides. And this is not something you would normally expect. So consumers bore the brunt of these increased prices of the tariffs. And then, of course, we had distribution impacts in both countries. Again, it matters where you're located, right? If you are located in an import competing sector, maybe you're working for one of these washing machine companies, it's great for you. But if you're located in an exporting sector, it's not good for you. If you're located in a firm that needs to buy cheaper inputs and now there are tariffs, it's not good for you. So again, there are all these distributional impacts. And it's quite interesting. We can get into it, but researchers have studied electoral impacts and so on and so forth. And basically, where we stand now is that in the short run, it appears that the US-China trade war definitely has not reversed the China shock situation at all. And it will not, because the import competing sector, which is supposed to protect, didn't really show substantial job increase. But the other sectors, the export sector, which was hit, right, they saw job losses. And the sector which needs all these cheaper inputs also saw job losses. So if anything, we are creating these new sort of mechanisms for job losses. And that's kind of where we are. And this is just the short run. We don't even know where we'll be in the long run. So I'll just stop there and maybe leave, answer other things while we do Q&A, because there's a lot of other interesting results from all of this. So hopefully that was useful for all of you.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to just give the, and if we could get Jingwu's slides pulled up.
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right. So I think at this point, everybody is sleepy a little bit, including myself. So I'm going to stand. Hope you don't mind. All right. So, I mean, it's a great order. We have an economist start with trade, and I'm a person from business school. So, so you will see kind of the viewpoint we have. We share some similarity, but the problem that we are chasing is, I think there's still some complementary parts. So I'm going to talk about some trends in global manufacturing and the supply chain, and include three parts. First is about these 20 years of manufacturing globalization. So I want to talk a little bit about history. So why we are here today, and then I'm going to talk about one thing. I think one of the speakers earlier talked about the IPEF. I'm going to provide my angle, and I'm going to provide, there's any parts that, still related to what China still play a large part. IPEF will not happen. My prediction is without China. And my third is I'm going to talk about some prediction on China. And then the next period, I want to call it Globalization 2.0. I don't see globalization dying, so I'll tell you why. I mean, for the record, I worked with some of your colleagues before. I have an article in Wall Street Journal, in the South China Morning Post, and also in VOA. So you can go to my website to learn more. 20 years of manufacturing globalization. So why China rises, right? I think As you know, China joined WTO in 2003. So this is the open of the product and service market in China that promoted this strong growth and modernization. And this is one thing to think about it. Fundamental reason is about global trade or global supply chain is just a transnational arbitrage of production factors. So think about what China has back in 2003. I think that's up to the September 11 episodes, right? You see the direct reason is China supports U.S. effort, the operation in Afghanistan. But the fundamental reason is these two countries are too complementary to each other. U.S. got technology and innovation and capital goods, the machines. China got cheap lands, and also we have labor. Okay, so fundamental, they should work together. It's just September 11 and also, the aftermath that creates a reason for that is very much moment that U.S. support China joining WTO. And why China and the U.S. are not getting well with each other, to me, I think the fundamental reason is China has grown. So as China accumulates capital, China's innovation potential threatens the United States' position in technology and advanced manufacturing. So I'm showing two pictures here. This is not my work, but it shows that before 2003, back in 2000, what is the central manufacturing hub? So well connected with a lot of export. I'm not here this morning, but I know the complexity, the data sets, however presented, is the most complicated with a lot of product offering in this region. It's not China, Japan. So that's back in 2000. And then look at 2017. It's clearly China right here. It replaces Japan, becomes the central hub of the manufacturing in this APEC region. So that's the rise of China. And also, I think a lot of voices on manufacturing moving out of China, reallocation of a global supply chain. I want to tell you, this is not just happened after the trade war. It has been happening as China slowly upgrading its manufacturing capability. I call it full round. First round, 2008, 2015, that is because of the production cost squeeze, exchange rate, US dollar and the Chinese renminbi, yuan. I think it was something about like 1.8, right? Now US dollar versus Chinese yuan become 1.6. So exchange rate, labor, capital costs, land prices all goes up. We all know the housing prices in China. So this is basically the cost story. And you see some of the, orders, manufacturing, low-end manufacturing move elsewhere, for example, to the Asian countries. The second round, 2016 and 2018, this is also initiated by China itself. At that time, wherever I go in China, from the, central provinces like Hunan to next to Shanghai, you see a lot of manufacturing producing, say, wind turbines. It's like every province is producing wind turbines, right? So we have a supply side problem. We have too much capability. So that was initiated by China itself. It's called supply side reform and overcapacity reduction. So these two rounds, you do see some of the manufacturing goes down, some of the production facilities shift out of China. But this is not due to the United States. China do it on itself. The third and the fourth round are attributed to the United States. The third round, 2018 to 2021, this is the trade war, as we have just seen. 6 batches of tariff all of a sudden happened in the third quarter of 2018, right? And this is by Donald Trump and his counterparty, President Xi in China. And then at that time, President Trump calls for a comprehensive decoupling, which didn't happen because we know supply chain are too complicated. Some of these are easy to break, like apparel, like a commodity, but electronic, EVs, this is difficult that the whole industrial chain has been centered, as the picture I showed you earlier, in China and around China. So not to mention other dependents such as FDI, venture capital, R&D. So this is all very large and difficult to fully disentangle. The fourth round is 2021, second quarter to present. This is after President Biden came into office. This is what we call targeted decoupling, and Biden has some policy which I think are effective. I have papers. Friendshoring, they did bring some of the manufacturing back to the U.S., reshoring and near U.S. And I call this as China-U.S. conflict escalation. Because you see the cheap ass, some of these technology bans, they're very, very targeted because they're realizing full decoupling is impossible. So they go for targeted decoupling to maintain US advantage. So this is picture come from my paper. Basically, I'm showing this is US sourcing restructuring before and after the trade war. So before the trade war, the green means the orders are increasing. So US companies like to go to China to give their manufacturing order to China. But look at the Asian countries, it's all red. There's no opportunity for Asian, okay? And then after 2018, I draw another picture using data. You see China, basically the color is almost white. There's no increase anymore, slowly increasing. But there are more opportunity for Asian countries becoming green. And also you see Japan becoming green again. And of course you see the Mexico and the Latin America. So there's an opportunity. So that is where the US has been effective in terms of diversifying its sourcing. It's no longer that dependent on China. So this is what we see from the data. And also there's a COVID-19 that is also related to China because I think back in 2020, my US friends told me, Jing, all of our 3M, our surgical mask is all held by Chinese custom because the biggest factory is in Shandong province of China. And I said, this is not China's fault. Look at the map. Around the 2020, the outbreak of COVID-19, almost all the countries around the world, they issue export ban on PP&E. China included. It's just China has the most capacity, and the 3M biggest factory is placed in China. But I think people learn from this, from this mistake that when this kind of thing happens, to have some local production capability, this is something very, very important, right? So that also increasing, some of the manufacturing, say nearshoring, reshoring, and trying to diversify their sources. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about IPEF a little bit. So IPEF, I also want to discuss, different country stance. So the goal for IPEF is US try to return to the APEC to restore influence and make it bigger, including India, the Indo-Pacific region. And then the US, the stance is talking about the money is not enough. We need to talk about the rules, the standards, the regulations. And countries in this region, they actually have different attitudes. Japan and South Korea, I think they look forward to US return to maintain the balance. They're very close to China, and China has growing, very big and fast. India, they definitely benefit, from the process of reducing dependence on China initiated by the US and by the Europe. And the Asian countries, I think they're in a subtle stage right now. Like I talked to some of the speakers yesterday, they hope to improve the regional economic development, but they do not want to particularly target China politically. So they're mostly neutral and trying to maintain the balance. And I read some of the lines after IPEF, and what I read is the criticism I see is it's more like a talking shopping. It's a hamburger without the beef. When China initiated a trade agreement with countries, they talk about the economy. So this is the beef. But for the IPEF, it seems less convincing to me. And also China will try to, provide the economic growth. Think about since the last 20 years, 40% of the world's economic growth is in China, and that will generate spillover to the neighboring region. But we all know this is going to be more challenging for China to continue to do so, given the current, China's own economic growth. So the traditional trade-off when we think about the global supply chain and the trade before IPEF is just about cost efficiency and concentration risk. So we are all talking about the economy, and then the cost aspect. So I'll skip some of my paper in interest of time. But I'm showing you the multinational US company. They're following the mercantilism is all about cost reduction. It's not about the patriotism like or so what. But this is the new trend. 4 pillars of IPEF. This is a new trend. They talk about the resilient economy, includes supply chain resilience. They talk about connected economy. This is about the digital trade standard. The third one is the clean energy. So this is to address the climate change. And the last one is about a fair economy. So tax and anti-corruption, corporation criticism, on China, a lot of them coming from the fair economy. So I break it into the forces driven global supply chain restructuring into the economic forces. So digital economy, green economy, industrial policy, And my viewpoint is China has advantages as long as it's economic factors. But China has a huge disadvantages when it comes to non-economic factors, the value, the friend sharing, friend sourcing, and the near sourcing. This is when China facing some challenges for this non-economic factor. So let's break it into pieces: digital, green, resilient economy. Remember, like I said, China still have advantages. First, resilient economy. So first of all, China manufacturing is very resilient. So this is this is the part I disagree with some of our media friends, because I also read a lot of issues on China and say, oh, you have this COVID-19, the city lockdown, factory cannot open. Because I do have a paper, I comparing Chinese factory versus say other manufacturing hub when COVID hits. Daegu in South Korea, Bavaria in Germany, Detroit, and Milan in Italy. What you find is that the speed the factory recover from the shock, even though China has very tough policy, is more resilient and faster than other manufacturing centers in the world. So you can read my paper, okay? So this is the mobility of this country, how agile it is, how in a way the people are cooperative with the government. I'm not commenting on whether they like it or not. But this is some of the Chinese strengths. You don't find it elsewhere. So manufacturing in China, according to the data in my research, is very resilient. I also have a working paper look at Shanghai lockdown last year. You can request me, to get a copy. That we also find it is very resilient. Most of the manufacturing capability and then the shipping volume just recover after 1 month and then rebounding back. So I don't find evidence that says resilient economy this is what IPEF pushing for. China has disadvantage. I don't find it in the data in my research. Second is about digital economy. I say this is the tail between two countries, because when it comes to connected economy and digital economy, what IPEF asking for, 80% of the digital economy is just spreading out between two countries, US and China. For example, let me tell you, TikTok or Kwai, they have operations in mainland China. They also have operations, say, in Brazil. They are making, in terms of the revenue, about $200 million in Brazil, but they're making 100 times of that revenue in China and in the US. Okay, so if you talk about, who's paying for this, TikTok, the videos, the online shopping, is just US and China. So in terms of technology and market size, it's just these two companies. But I think IPEF is gonna challenge, some countries, because there's this new words also in the fields of information system. We're talking about digital authoritarianism. I know some of you, read papers, articles, and even have a book related to this issue. So when the data security becomes more like, the government is more concerned about and want to have a control, this shared value, political trust, and data security, this will become a more emerging issues, whether you want to adopt a US digital internet company or maybe a Chinese digital internet company. That will create problem as we see today. But again, China has advantage in its digital internet companies. The third one is the green economy, and I think this is the point I'm making. Who is the producer? Okay, at this very moment, we cannot have a green economy without China. If you look at the EV cells, the wind turbine, the PVs, the batteries, the rare earths, the solar panels, the red share, this is the Chinese capacity share in the world. So when the Germany is pushing for the green energy, you essentially what you find is it needs the solar panels shifted from Shanghai. So we do see the shipment data, the bill of lading data. We do see that increasing. And because of the Ukrainian war, the EV cars, China is increasing the share of the global market, more than 50%. And then when it comes to the non-economic factor, I would say this is a problem. This is a major challenge China is facing. So first of all, as I said, the competition between the US and China, fundamentally to me is the economy. But when the economy interest becoming bigger enough, it becomes political. So we do see some unilateral containment, the trend of small yard high fences imposed from US and China, like a tariff, export control, and the rule of origin, so USMCA. So they're not checking about the product final assembly, but they talk about the parts and the components. And also, in the U.S., there's a trend of delisting of a Chinese stock. So this is the unilateral containment. We also see, in a way that they are also increased investment U.S. is making. U.S. is putting more effort in the R&D and industrial policy distortion through compensation. So this is something. Let's be realistic. U.S. is also doing industrial policy and also compensation. And not just China is expert that, U.S. is also doing that. 40 years ago, if you look at history, China did that for this chip industry. Until U.S. Japan. Japan did it for the chip industry 40 years ago. Until U.S. think, oh, this is too much. I don't want Japan to move into that direction. And you all know what happened. They signed a deal with Japan. And the U.S. is also trying to leverage its allies, so strengthening the allies, emphasizing the value, so technology, product standard, economic trade rule, nearshore, friendshoring, human rights, and the democracy concerns. So I have a papers checking all of these issues. Whenever this becomes institutionalized, written into the law, you do find the company, they consider this, and they may rethink where they want to source, find a supplier. Okay, so this is going to be challenges faced by China. And let me tell you, one of the reasons I say, this is political, but mostly because of the economical, U.S. trying to maintain its advantage in technology. I look at all the patent filing data, global patent filing data, signed by the Paris, the PCT Accord. And I look at the industry, you look at in the past five years, U.S. and China, which industry they have applied their patents. And I'm looking at the share of Chinese patents divided by the US applications. And you see the top several industry that China is 74%, 56%, 40% of all the patents US has filing and registered globally. And look at this industry. Data communication, telecommunication, audio-visual technology, control, industry control, and communication basic program. This is Huawei we're talking about, okay? So the reason you see that, one of the US targeted Huawei, I think fundamental reason is this communication, telecommunication, this is what Huawei good about, is threatening US position in terms of this, technology in this domain. But if you look at some of the industry that I would say China is pretty weak in terms of technology innovation, for example, pharmaceuticals, China is only 2% of US filing, okay, all the patents. So will you think US will target a Chinese pharmaceutical company? No, it wants Chinese market. You can also use some of the old, pharmaceutical drug technology, but you can open a factory in China and get its market. Okay, so this is trying to make sense why this thing, Huawei is targeted, and hopefully, as a media reporter, we can think deeply, the fundamental reason. So the yellow ones, these are the industry I think are sort of dangerous if China play catching up fast and US find it threatening, and potentially maybe some of the Chinese company will be the next Huawei. Okay, so that's my argument. So before I conclude, I want to give some prediction on China and Globalization 2.0. The first, I think, is the US order, I don't expect it coming back. When the supply chain has restructured, when you see a lot of factory being built in Mexico, the capacity is there for long term. So I'm not going to expect them to come back. But so as China's only viable solution, I think, some of the speakers talk about it's not profitable to go to Laos or go to the Middle Asia, but this is the only solution. Is the Chinese manufacturing capacity will shift to domestic need and bear on the road countries. No matter these countries can afford the products, no matter the volatility, the uncertainty there, but no other option. So I think this is something will happen. So you see the trend of Chinese, domestic market, domestic consumption still goes up, but this is the export. Export is pretty flattened, but the domestic consumption goes up. So number two, I think China will maintain its strength in quality labor. So among the reporters we have in the room, I think some of you have Chinese or Eastern Asian heritage. Then you understand this. The Chinese family will support the children's education at low cost. And they don't calculate the investment return. The investment return to me, if you look at the salary a lot of young people are paid in mainland China, the investment in education in China could be even negative. But it gives utility to the family. Okay, so if you also look at the Chinese government, how much budget they allocate to education each year, the central government I'm talking about, this is not really a high number by any standard comparing to the peering countries. But in terms of, this is something, the extra curriculum. So if you can read Chinese, extra curriculum, like I'm one of the kids myself when I was young. In the evening and the weekend, I go to all these places to learn additional English, additional Olympic mathematics, something like that. This is the investment the Chinese family, as a tradition, they do. They don't care about the return. Okay, so who is really providing extra subsidy for the quality labor? My viewpoint is, let's don't forget about the Chinese tradition, about the family. I think this is very different comparing to other countries if you do not live in China. So plus China has a tradition in raising high skill and uniform labor. And the very last, this is due to the US. Intellectual returnees, mostly due to US, contribute greatly to Chinese industrial upgradation. So when the tension between the US and China goes up, you will see, and I have witnesses that, is that my friends who use for, say, Google's driverless car way more, he just returned to Baidu, unmanned driving, move from Silicon Valley to Beijing. So you see all of these intellectual returnees, they still go back home. So something we understand China is, I think we still go to its history of thousands of years, that this is really like an agriculture country for a long time, and people stick to their home, to their land, do not, become that mobile around comparing to other countries. And the third, I predict China will maintain its high production network centrality. I look at the trade between the China and also the RCEP and also the Belt and Road region. I find that most of the time they're complementary and cooperative. Asian countries, for example. So Asian is also relying on China. So the complexity index, if you go to check the Harvard website, you find that in terms of the complete industrial chain, right? I mean, I'm not talking about a new product. The new product, according to Harvard website, I checked last night, is like 17. But in terms of the completeness of produce any kinds of product, China ranked #1 in the world, according to this Harvard website. So all the Asian countries comparatively are smaller. They will need something from China to complete its industrial chain. So complementary and cooperative. Eventually, I don't think China's production network centrality will drop. And number 4, while trade may decrease, globalization too picks up. So what's globalization too? Is that after the COVID-19, after US-China trade war, all this disruption at the sea, which is also threatened Singapore economy, by the way, is that we do see that countries around the world have a tendency to do reshoring and nearshoring, right? Because you can just export your standard, your licensing, your technology, knowledge, and cross-border financing. The Tesla factory will be built in Mexico, for example. It will be exactly the same standard as the Shanghai factory they already have. Okay, so this is the idea. This is a globalization too. So we do not need to look at all these shipping containers over there, but something more virtual, the patent licensing, the cross-border financing, and the knowledge, and then the tenant transfer. Number 5, the geoeconomic buffer zone faces opportunity. As I mentioned, since China joined WTO in 2003, 20 years, 80% of the global economic growth, according to the data, is just allocated to 2 countries, half and half, US and China. So countries like Asian countries, if they want to develop manufacturing, I don't have a chance. I cannot compete with China in terms of the production factors. But I think now is the time. And this is something good for Singapore, right? Because if an Asian country, they need a kind of financial services, I think still, Singapore will be the hub. So we can look at this as something we call the geoeconomic buffer zone. They can serve as bridges and platform to carry out economic cooperation and promote cross-border trade. And this is one last insight I want to share here is even though there will be opportunity in places like Singapore, like Asian countries, you will still find a lot of Chinese businessmen. So in May, I was visiting the US for almost 1 month. I take a detour to Mexico. I look at the economic zone. Man, it's like all these factories. You see a lot of Chinese business over there. So Chinese companies are really good at dealing with this emerging economy, like Asian countries, like Mexico. I think in a way they're better to do that than the US businessmen and the European businessmen. Why? Emerging economy, uncertain political situation, institution is weak, right? There could be corruptions anywhere, right? And think about this is what the Chinese businessman has been dealing with for decades. So they're good at it, okay? And if you send a EU businessman to Mexico, to Laos, to Cambodian, you do know, like, okay, we are on recording here. So, but you get the idea is that the weak institutions, this is something the Chinese businessmen are really good about. So I also went to Hanoi in Vietnam. So at least some of our MBA, kids about my age to visit Vietnam. And we all see it's like the top managers are Chinese, but the middle tier are all local, Vietnamese, okay? And it works really well. So how to deal with an emerging developing country and weak institution, they know how to do it. Okay, so summary. China's rise in globalization has relied on its comparative advantage in labor, industrial scale. So US and China work with each other. I think this is destiny. And now the conflict rises because it's no longer that complementary. And then also, my viewpoint is, I'm not talking about any kind of political regime kind of story, your belief, your value, but just from an economic perspective, they're becoming more alike. So second, the impact of, say, natural disaster, COVID, and geopolitical risk had led to frequent disruption in global supply chain. So the whole trend going forward, anywhere in the world, is about reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. And the third, we need to pay attention to the geoeconomic buffer zone, like Asian countries and Mexico. I forgot my last bullet point. I even changed some slides last night. Okay, so India, Mexico, Southeast Asia, and Africa, I think they have the potential to be the new factory in the next decades to come. So Africa, if you really look far into the future, it may happen. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, for Indian, and also we already see it's happening in Mexico. So you probably read the news already. I think in the latest quarter, Mexico is US #1 in terms of the importing. Okay, so this is something is already changing. So the world is changed, but I'm trying to provide some prediction. I'm not that pessimistic. I agree that China is not doing optimal, as the first speaker you had yesterday, right? But I don't think this thing will go away. And I think the Asian as a whole is complementary and cooperative. In certain industries, certain products, it is the competitor, but it still needs to work with China.
Okay, thank you. All right, I know there's a ton of information there. We have questions already.
Hi, this is Manas. I work for PTA, Press Trust of India, Indian news agency. My question is that, in fact, we have seen in the last few years China's growing conflict with a number of countries. In fact, besides US, it has conflict with India, it has conflicts with a number of ASEAN countries. People in Europe are also not very comfortable with China. So, various parts of the world, we have seen that there is growing question mark over China's overall political behavior, and which is also putting question mark over trade issues. Like with Australia also, China is having a big kind of trade war, which is now slowly being resolved. So in the long run, in fact, considering China's increasing